Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is the program that we bring to you every other week outside of the legislative session to update you on big policy news in Washington state, what's happened in our state. Very rarely we'll have some guests on. Usually it's our center directors to bring you the latest on what's been happening here and the impact on your life. Coming up very shortly, about mid-January, we'll start doing Washington Policy on the Go every week because the legislative session starts on January 13th. So you'll see us here every week. And we'll also do a live Washington Policy on the Go soon in Seattle. You'll stay tuned for announcements on that in the coming weeks. We'll announce it in our newsletter. But we'll have a couple of live events where if you want to join us and ask more questions in our downtown offices, we'll have an opportunity for you to do that. So looking forward to the new year and tackling the legislative session. But today we've got a great program. It's Todd Myers, our Vice President for Research, is going to join us because in part, now that the election is over and now that the results are in, it has become both appalling and shocking to see a sudden new wave of honest assessment of the impact of the CCA come into the media. And I wanted to talk to Todd about it because he spent so much time laying out what the actual impacts of the CCA were, what it would mean to costs of gasoline and fuel, and what it would mean to other energy sources. And a lot of time was spent from other advocates denying this information. So I was just saying that, in the Seattle Times, we had the story yesterday, I believe it was, where, we spent a lot of time laying out this material over the past year, showing that that there was big problems with the Climate Commitment Act. And you were pointing out how much it cost and what the impact was. And people were doing things, including the head of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, saying things like, there's no price impact of this tax, or if the tax is cut, it's not clear whether that will impact prices. And all of that has suddenly disappeared with this new article. Why don't you walk us through it?
Yeah, so there was a couple of key things, points that we were making during the campaign. The first, most basic, and actually for the last few years, the most basic is that a CO2 tax is essentially a tax on gasoline, and that it would increase gasoline prices. We made that claim in 2022. That was when Governor Inslee said, no, we were wrong. It would be pennies. The Department of Ecology staff said, no, that's ridiculous. Our models show it's going to be like 5 cents a gallon. And we said, no, it's much more than that. And sure enough, in the summer of 2023, we were proven to be correct. And there were actually lots of articles saying that we were correct. I think I've mentioned this before. My favorite was that in 2022, a TV station in Spokane did a fact check on us and declared us to be, lying, that what we were saying wasn't true. And then later in 2023, they did a fact check and said, oh, actually, Todd was right. so that was one of the most basic things. And we pointed out
but let's not forget Danny Westneat, the columnist for the Seattle Times, pointing out that you were right and then saying, yeah, but the other side was using strategic disinformation. I believe
so
that was the phrase.
He said, but we need the policy. And so a certain amount of what he called strategic misinformation and others all lies was understandable because we need a climate policy. So anyway, you can argue about whether it's worth it, whether the price is worth it. That's fine. It's a fine argument to have. But they wouldn't even get to that point of admitting that there was a price to be paid. So we argued that, and we argued that, in fact, that the price would go up over time. During the campaign, as you mentioned, the head of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, amongst others, said that, no, that was a lie. Well, there was an article in the Seattle Times yesterday talking about the companies that had complied by turning in CO2 allowances that they had to buy on the market. This is essentially the way that the tax functions. And the quote that was included in the Seattle Times article was, as the program moves forward, polluters can either compete for the dwindling number of allowances, and then in parentheses it says, the cost of which will increase as time goes on.
Right.
And the quote, and the person who said that is ecology spokesperson Caroline Halter. So here now the Department of Ecology is openly saying the price is going to go up. And so this is what we've been saying all along. You know, they disputed to some extent that it would be passed on to consumers, but now that's widely acknowledged. It was funny, the Seattle Times also said, well, this year the impact has only been 26 cents a gallon. Okay, but that's because prices went down compared to last year. There was one where they said, well, it's not the 50 cents a gallon that people have been claiming, it's only 26 cents a gallon. But those two numbers are based on literally the same calculation. But the price went up in 2023 and then it came down in 2024. And that's the second sort of bit of dishonesty that has now been changed after the election. When the prices at the auction for CO2 allowances went down early in 2024, we said, well, sure, if you're uncertain about whether the system will even exist in 2025, why would you bid on allowances to be turned in 2025 when those allowances would be worthless? So what companies did is they bid the minimum possible, and other people in the market, people who don't have compliance obligations, but would buy allowances maybe to sell later, hopefully for a higher price, they got out of the market, because if they bought and then there was no system, they would lose all their money. So what ended up happening was that the price went down. And we said, well, of course it went down. It went down because Initiative 2117 is on the ballot. There's uncertainty whether the program will even exist. Well, there was an article written about that, and the Seattle Times reporter started off the article by saying that the low prices were an "I told you so" moment for supporters of the CO2 tax, because he said that they had been claiming all along that the prices would come down and that they would moderate and that the early prices were too volatile. Well, that was nonsense. It was about the fact that there was this uncertainty. And so there's a group called Clean and Prosperous Washington, which is headed by Reuben Carlyle, who wrote the CO2 tax and funded primarily by BP, the oil company. And they have said all along, oh, no, the prices in 2024, the reason they're low is just because the market is maturing and we're not going to see them go up again. And this is going to be more like what's normal. Well, guess what? Sure enough, immediately after the election, prices went up. So in the most recent auction, prices were 35% higher than they had been just 3 months before. On the private market, so that there's a private market, so people can either buy from the state, or they can at the quarterly auctions, or they can buy anytime from the private market. The private market, the prices shot up even higher. They more than doubled to $59 a metric ton. So prices went up, immediately after the election, because now that the system, they know that the system is going to exist, there's more demand for the allowances. Okay, so we've been saying this all along.
Yeah. Well, that's the frustrating part, is on each of these stages, even the fact that the price went down to 26 cents when they're saying, well, people were saying close to 50 cents, but it's really 26. You pointed that out, saying it will fluctuate with this calculation. But as you pointed out, it's the same calculation. And it's also not a mystery. I mean, California is using the same formula. The experts that are quoted in the paper that they look up, are saying that's the calculation to use. So there's no mystery, except for our officials have gotten away with, and advocates got away with, saying things that were blatantly and obviously not true over the course of many months.
And the cover that reporters would have is, well, it's unclear. We're not certain about what will happen. It's, who knows? But oftentimes, like I said, in the articles, they would give the lead on this very sort of dramatic, this is an "I told you so" moment, as if they knew what they were talking about. So having gone through this all year, pointing out, look, here's the reason why the prices are depressed. The market is going to go up, as the Department of Ecology now admits. Prices are going to continue to go up. So I read last week. So last week was the auction where prices went up 35% in one auction. And I read this quote from the Seattle Times. allowance prices earlier this year might have been lower because companies were waiting to see whether the repeal effort would pass, said State Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, the majority leader for the Democrats, who was also one of the main supporters of the CO2 tax.
And didn't you
So
debate
after
him
the
on
election,
TVW?
huh?
Well, isn't he the representative you debated on TVW over this?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and now that the election is over, they're saying, oh, well, yeah, the reason that the prices were low all year is because there was uncertainty, but now there's not uncertainty. The prices have shot back up, which is exactly what we were saying. So, like these two quotes coming in less than a week from people who had previously denied both of these things, and now admitting, oh, well, of course that's true, because it's now convenient for them to do so. I just think is outrageous. It shows that, you know, and as you mentioned, Danny Westney, that strategic misinformation. The strategy all along was to be dishonest about the cost of the tax, the impact of the tax, you know, why things were happening in the market, and then get through the election. And so they did it. They won. We are now stuck with the tax. That price is going to keep going up, as the Department of Ecology admits. And we'll see how high it goes and whether people are still willing to pay it.
Well, at least our roads and bridges will be fixed, because my understanding is all this revenue is essential to the preservation of roads and bridges.
Well, and of course that's nonsense. And the department, you know, Washington State Department of Transportation is now asking for more than $1 billion extra a year because our roads and bridges are in such a bad shape, right? Can they take the money from the CO2 tax? Well, no,
Not
because
as
the
it's
CO2
currently
tax
written.
is prohibited from using it. So they have to say, well, we need money from some other source. So, you know, this whole campaign where they said, oh, roads and bridges, we need the money. Well, yeah, we do need money for roads and bridges, but as we said, the taxes are prohibited from going there.
The frustrating part about this is the accountability issue, and having, you know, regional media, I would think, would see this and then think, how do I trust these individuals? Because there's no way, you know, like you say, so short after the election, they suddenly had oh my gosh, Todd was right. You know, I was totally wrong in how I was arguing this whole time, because nothing has changed over all these months. I mean, this is the same formula, the same stuff, the same material, same data. And now it's this, it says, okay, well, now that we're safe, now that this policy is safe, we're going to admit that it's going to heavily increase costs, and it's going to get more expensive as time goes on. You know, and it's going to be hard to make people pay a price that are in positions of authority for lying to the public on, or using strategic misinformation to get the public to do what they want.
I think there are two things. One, I think in the case of the TV station Spokane, they honestly didn't know, right? They have a guy like me who they don't know saying one thing, and the Department of Ecology getting very irate and very condescending, saying, no, that's absolutely incorrect. Todd doesn't know what he's talking about. So if you're a reporter in that situation and you don't know who to trust, it's pretty hard to say that the Department of Ecology is lying. That's, you know, people don't like to make that accusation, especially about, you know, authority figures. To their benefit, the TV station, when the data were in, said, oh, guess what? Todd was right. Ecology was wrong. So that, I think in some cases, they simply don't know who to trust. We make our best argument and then they try to sort it out. But in other cases, I think that the reporters know what they're doing. And they're very clear, you know, when they think something is true, they say it. But when they know something is true and they kind of don't want it to be, then they say, well, we don't really know, you know, could be this. Then they start to muddy the waters and prevaricate and all these sorts of things. And I think that's what you saw so much of the news coverage in 2024 was this, well, this side says this and this side says this, and it's really hard to know. And well, no, it's not hard to know. And the evidence is that, you know, here we are a month after the election, and two of the key claims that the other side were making about the price of carbon, they admit we're both wrong.
You mentioned the price of carbon. We just had the auction. I know you've written about it and mentioned it just a moment ago, but any further insights you wanted to share about that auction and what to expect over the coming year on those auctions?
Well, the price went up. It didn't go up as much as I expected. It didn't go up as much as the private market. Like I said, the auction price was $40 a metric ton, which is 32 cents a gallon, I think. Um, the private market, though, the state market was $40 a metric ton. The private market was $59, which is about 50 cents a gallon. So the private market is much higher. There's a little bit of a premium in the private market because it's more flexible. And there's, the companies who bought, or the investors who bought and then want to resell, they want to make some money. So they're going to charge a little bit of a higher price. So it's not surprising that there's a premium for those over what the state would charge. But 35% jump is big. And I think we're going to see a jump again next year. And the reason is the number of allowances that are being offered by the state. It's a little bit complicated, but I won't get into it. But by the number of allowances offered by the state is declining 12% next year. And just to put that in context, 12% reduction in CO2 emissions is what Washington State saw during 2020 during COVID. That's how much these folks are going to have to, people who have compliance obligations like oil companies, but also like University of Washington, the city of Enumclaw, all sorts of other companies who have compliance obligations. That's the market that they're going to be in with significantly fewer allowances. So we're going to see the price go up next year. Again, I've been predicting this. Now the Department of Ecology admits it.
What happens if they don't? I mean, let's say, as you point out, calling for a new a COVID-like shutdown of the economy in order to accomplish a goal. Obviously, that's not something people are going to put up with willingly. So what happens if they fail?
So let's say that the amount of allowances goes down so much that prices skyrocket because people can't adjust that rapidly. Then there are circuit breakers, and we hit a couple of these in the first year of the system. So basically, at one level, they put a bunch of credits on the market at a fixed rate, at a lower price. So they say, okay, above this, we're going to give a certain amount. And then if the prices go up even above that, then people can buy as many credits as they need at sort of the highest, but there's a cap rate at the highest rate. So there's a couple of ways that they have to increase the number of allowances in the short term to reduce prices. Here's the problem with that. The state law requires that we meet certain CO2 emission reduction targets. So all that does is take credits from the future and move them forward. So what that means is that the future targets are harder to hit. There's less flexibility in the future in order to drive down prices now. It doesn't stop the amount of credits from declining year after year. So not only do you have the consistent year after year decline in the number of allowances available, you also have the fact that the flexibility that those years could have had is now gone because you've moved all those forward. So that's the concern, is that you could get into a death spiral. They're not a bunch of free credits that allow you to bust the caps. You still have to meet the caps by 2030.
And is there a limit to how many times you can kick those down the road? Like you said, if you grab credits from the future and apply them to today to lower the prices, is there a time when that runs out, or could you just keep doing that?
Well, I mean, there's a limited number of allowances that are set aside for these sort of contingencies. And yeah, so it's theoretical that you could run out of that number of allowances. And then we would have to see what they do. During the campaign, Joe Fitzgibbon, who I just quoted, in the Seattle Times editorial board, was asked, well, what are you going to do if the prices get too high? And he said, well, it's theoretical that we could add credits. Well, what that means is essentially getting rid of the existing targets, just changing the targets arbitrarily. And that's what we've seen in a lot of cap and trade systems. which is in Europe and elsewhere, that when the caps get too tough, politicians simply come in and say, oh, well, here, we'll hand you free credits, we'll hand you free credits, we'll raise the limits, other things like that, and play political games. The irony of that is that what we are told repeatedly is that the targets are set scientifically. They just happen to end on decades and they just happen to be visible by 5, but by God, they're scientific. But the fact that they would openly say, oh, well, if price gets too high, and again, too high just means there's too much political pressure. It's not any sort of metric. It's just like, if I feel politically uncomfortable, then I will do something. So if the prices will get too high, well, then we'll change the system. And that's the problem with very complicated systems like cap and trade, is that it is ripe for political manipulation to achieve political goals rather than being focused on, meeting some sort of scientific or other goal, which is the rhetoric, but it's not the reality.
I only wish somebody had written a book about how people could actually make environmental change that wasn't subject to all this politics.
Yeah. Well, and that's what we need to do, is that we need to connect people more directly to the impacts of their decisions, which gives them an incentive to use resources more wisely. But it also allows them to make personal decisions about what's acceptable, what prices are acceptable, what prices are not acceptable. Right now, the way it is that a few people in Olympia decide for all of us what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And then, when something goes wrong, they simply say, no, that's a lie, until the point, and then they could say, oh, the election's over. Oh yeah, that was all the truth, right? That's the system that we have now, is that a few people make the decisions for everyone else and impose the system and tell everyone else, and look, you just need to deal with it, and pay the price whether you like it or not. I mean, one other example of that is that in the election year last year, there were $200 rebates handed out to a significant number of utility customers from the CO2 tax. And there were letters that said, hey, this rebate comes to you thanks to the CO2 tax, the Climate Commitment Act. Isn't this great? I can tell you one thing that's not happening next year. Another round of $200 rebates, because they're going to use every single dollar that they have. They don't have to, tell people, hey, we're going to reduce the cost impact on you, because it's not an election year and the system is not under threat. So I'd be willing to bet you that we will not see those rebates again next year.
Question from the audience: this anonymous attendee asks, are the penalties for not meeting the CO2 goals tied to the carbon market, or are they fixed? IOW, would it be possible that it's cheaper to pay the fines than buy the credits?
No. The fines are based, I believe, and it's been a while since I've looked at this, so there's probably some nuance that I'm missing. The fines are based on the price of the credits, and so it's a multiple. So yes, they give you a very strong incentive to engage in the market and pay that, rather than just violate the law and then pay the penalty. That's why when the first compliance round occurred, everybody complied except one company, and that company was essentially, I think, in bankruptcy and restructuring, and they openly said, yeah, this got lost. We'll fix this. But everybody else complied, and the reason simply is it's far cheaper to comply than it is to pay the penalty.
The other question was about Inslee and his desire for a wealth tax. The thought was that he's already out. It's not exactly your area, but I think it's probably safe to say, even on his way out, that doesn't mean he's not going to want to make a splash or two or set an agenda.
Right. So his budget came out today. From what I understand, he has part of his proposal is a $6.9 billion basically confiscation of wealth, where you take what are called unrealized gains. So if I have a stock and I don't actually have it, but I own the stock, but not the cash, and they say, hey, you've made a lot of money on this stock. It's currently worth, however much, whatever the threshold is, we're going to take 3% of that. Well, it's like, I don't actually have the money. mean, imagine them doing the same thing with your house. Whoa, your house is worth $1 million. You need to pay us, a portion. We now own a portion of your house. Well, no, I don't have the cash, right? I
Right.
mean, the house is worth that, but I don't have the money. So it's essentially a confiscation. And then the other thing is that, if the price of the stock goes down in the interim, what do? Rebate them? So it's a really silly system. And it'll be interesting to see if all the billionaires who gave money to the governor's last campaign and to the campaign, the tax, the CO2 tax and things like that, if they support this, if they say, you're right, I should be paying more, here you go, or whether they do what Jeff Bezos did and said, we're going to leave the state. I think it's just so short-sighted. One, it's wrong, right? It's wrong for the government just to start grabbing people's money, just because they've utterly mismanaged their budget. Seattle Times editorial made this very clear yesterday and said this was predictable. Everybody knew this was coming. You mismanaged your budget. You spent money, one-time money, on ongoing expenditures, and now you created a problem for yourself.
Another great editorial after the election. That's
yes.
really hard hitting for people. Yeah. Hard hitting coverage there afterward. So
yeah. So to take people who have utterly mismanaged their budget, and then for them to say, "Well, I screwed up completely. I knew this was a screw up, but I did it anyway. Now you have to pay." One, I just think that that's completely immoral is too strong a word, but it's very dubious. But the second thing is, having Jeff Bezos as a member of our community is a good thing. You should not just simply measure the worth of people in our community based on how much money the government can collect from them. And that is that is how folks are being treated. We have the Allen Brain Institute. We have lots of things that Paul Allen did around here because he was a member of this community and was connected to it. That's a good thing. That goes far beyond whatever taxes he could pay. Jeff Bezos could have been the same thing. Others, I am certain, if they pass this wealth tax, which again should be unconstitutional, but the state Supreme Court has done some strange things recently. But even if it's constitutional, even if they collect it, there will be people in this community who simply leave. And we reduce their ties to these communities, and we will be poorer for it, both in real terms and I think in sort of societal terms, for driving people, innovators, smart people who have done amazing things in our community, and essentially telling them, your value to us is only what you can give the government and nothing else. And I just think that that's wrong.
Well, Bezos, before he left, his family was responsible for the largest cancer research gift ever in history here, at Hutch, I believe. So you're absolutely right. I mean, from the arts and culture to kids programs to medical research, there's a lot going on there. Plus the basic fairness issue. And I wondered, though, I'm just going to play devil's advocate here or poke at you a little bit, which is, I'm not sure that they screwed up. I feel like there's a lot of, there was expenses that went on. Some of them were raises for political allies. And if it's one-time funding and it's clear to everybody, there's not stupid people, they're dealing with budgets in the past, they have professional legislative staff advising them what's going to happen. If you use one-time funds for these, it's more like a planned or designed deficit. It's not a screw up if you did it on purpose and the result is what you wanted. But it certainly plays out like that,
So I think that's right. I think the fact that they publicly are saying, we couldn't have known this, revenue went down. It's like, well, if you're that incompetent, why should we trust you with the next budget?
Right.
But I think that you're right. I mean, I do think that they intentionally put themselves in this position. I think the Seattle School District did the exact same thing. They took one-time money, paid it in ongoing costs, and then this year we're like, well, now we have to close schools because we've put ourselves in this position. So if that is the case, if they intentionally mismanage their budget to create a crisis that then they could manipulate, well, I mean, I think the voters and the people of the state of Washington should know that and say the way that, people, a certain number of politicians in the state see you is just a bank for their agendas. And they are going to try to manipulate you in whatever way that they can to get that. So, for instance, I mean, during that debate with Joe Fitzgibbon, he got very heated and said, "Okay, Todd, if we don't have this money, what are you going to cut? What are you going to cut? Education? You know, they talked about, oh, that childhood asthma funding would be cut, which was nonsense." And I said, okay, you have proposed, the governor has agreed to a $1.3 billion increase in pay raises for state employees. I said, Joe, are you going to pay that? Are you going to support that? And he said, yes, we need to pay our state employees. Okay, that's their priority. Their priority is that given a choice between pay raises for state employees and funding for asthma or education or things like that, they're going to give it to the state employees unions who support their campaigns. Fine, they can say that. But what they're doing is that they're manufacturing a crisis so that they can pay that $1.3 billion in pay raises to people who support them ideologically and politically. Okay, that's what people need to realize is going on, and that the choices that are being made with their money, and it's not just the pay raises. We've talked about this a lot in the way we spend environmental money. The way we spend environmental money is not based on, does it yield results? Does it help the environment? The way we spend environmental money is spend it on things that help political allies and make me look good. People need to realize that. I hope that people wake up to that. They did not during the campaign. They felt like that this expenditure was going to good things. I think that they simply don't know, but we need to do a better job of explaining that to them. But I think this manufactured crisis is a good example of how, as I think you're correct, people who knew what they were doing are creating a crisis so that they can put pressure on the public to pay up.
Two quick questions. One, isn't our state property tax just a wealth tax?
It could be. We have a lot of limits. Obviously, there's a 1% limit. There's a lot of limits on that. So I guess I'm sure that there are tax experts who are better than me who can explain why it isn't. But there's a big limit on that. We also have limits on, if you're older than a certain amount, you don't pay, those sorts of things. So, but again, with a stock. If the stock goes up and you pay at the peak and then it goes down, you don't get money back. Property taxes don't swing like that. They're not, they're not volatile like that, like other, wealth and other things like that is. So I think that there's a touch of that, but I think it's, substantially different.
Todd, I know you've got another meeting coming up, as do I, and so we're going to have to leave it at that. Really appreciate everybody coming on board today. And Merry Christmas to you all, because this is the last Washington Policy on the Go for the year. And then we'll be back in January. We'll be there every week when the legislative session starts. That's January 13th. So after the 13th, we'll be here every week until the legislative session is over. Todd and his team will be tackling all of the comings and goings of the legislature, as well as our own priorities. So it's going to be a heck of a year coming up. And Todd, thanks a lot for your insights today.
Thanks for having me on. Merry Christmas.
Hey, you too. All right. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join us again. If you saw something you really wanted to share with others, don't forget, this will be up on YouTube, and you can share it with them as well. We'll probably delete the portion of my stalling when we're having some technical difficulties, but other than that, it'll be right up there on our YouTube channel coming up, and you can share it then. Merry Christmas to everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next year.